This Grand Prix might have been one of my favorite races to watch in such a long time. The excitement that lasted so far into the race with Kimi and George going back and forth, the drama unfolding when George stopped seeing a podium of the greats. An overall very exciting Canadian Grand Prix weekend, so let's recap it all. Hi, welcome back to the Great Girls Formula, your F1 podcast where we talk about what makes Formula One so interesting, from the technical details and strategy to the people, decisions, and stories behind the races. If you aren't already, make sure to subscribe, like this video, follow us on Instagram at Great Girls Formula for even more Formula One content, and let's just hop right in because we don't need to waste any time. I feel like there is just so much that I could say about this Grand Prix, and I don't even know where to begin, but I think the most obvious one is probably the fight at Mercedes. There was a very exciting sprint race between the two Mercedes drivers, between Russell and Antonelli. Antonelli had a little bit of a skirmish with Russell where he attempted to go around the outside of him during the sprint. It was a very ambitious move, and he got kind of pushed off by Russell as a result. This caused Antonelli to go on the radio, have a little bit of a, I'm not going to call it a tantrum, but maybe I will. This caused Antonelli to have a little bit of a whining sesh on the radio while he felt like the team needed to do something about that. He felt like it was an unfair move on Russell's part, that he pushed him off of the track. Again, it was quite a ambitious move in general for Antonelli, and I do think that he learned his lesson, which I think we saw in the race itself and the way that he fought Russell during that. But it definitely was interesting to see Antonelli kind of have this reaction. I think it was a moment of realization, of remembering that he is very young. He is literally 19 years old, and I think that Toto Wolff actually cut him quite a lot of slack in the end when they spoke about this afterwards in the media. They were saying, you know, what else can you expect from a 19-year-old, relatively inexperienced driver in the grand scheme of things, having an emotional moment, having a little bit of a moment of whining on the radio. It happens. And they had a discussion about this after the fact, but it definitely seemed very tense at the end of the sprint race, with Russell in first, Norris in second, having taken advantage of the skirmish between Russell and Antonelli, and then we had Antonelli in third, and it was tense. It was terse. So you could tell Antonelli did not seem all that happy in comparison to how he's been reacting in the last few races. You could tell there was a little bit of animosity there, so it's going to be very interesting to see how this continues throughout the rest of the season. At the race itself, the first 30 laps of this Grand Prix was just so much back and forth between Kimi and George. I was like, I can't keep up. I'm like, who's in front now? Like, it's just going back and forth. It ended around lap 30 when George Russell unfortunately had a critical power failure and he had to retire the car. Honestly, heartbreaking for Russell, to the point where he literally threw out his headrest and tossed it over the car. He was very, very unhappy with the whole situation. He did issue a statement after the fact apologizing for that, because that is definitely not very safe. But in the moment, the emotions, it does kind of seem like somebody has it out for him. I think that Antonelli, his driving has been superb. I think it's been so strong. But I also really think that Russell has had just bad luck after bad luck. I feel like of the 4 races now that Antonelli has won consecutively, the only person to do that, by the way, to win their first 4 wins consecutively, and I did fact check that this time because I know I got it wrong last week, but it is actually true this time. But of those races, I really think that George has had pretty bad luck in 3 of those 4. I still think that Antonelli would have given George a run for his money. When everything opened in Australia, we were kind of like, this is George's season. It seemed like he had it in the bag. I, for one, did not foresee Antonelli coming this close to Russell, and I really do think that he's not going to make it easy for Russell. I do think that his reaction to the sprint did, again, like I said, remind us a little bit of his immaturity, and I am very curious to see how their dynamic shifts and changes throughout the season. Something that we need to remember, especially thinking back on last year with Piastri, is Piastri looked super duper strong in the beginning of the season, and then he had a little bit of a dip. And I think that that could very well be what happens to Kimi. If we remember Kimi last year as well, he was doing pretty well at the start of the season. He had a few pretty poor races in the middle there and then kind of bounced back at the end. And something that we have to remember, especially for these newer drivers, is that the Formula One season is extremely intense. There's so many more races in one season for Formula One than there is in the feeder series and F2 and F3, etc., etc. So they aren't used to that kind of stamina of having to keep up this kind of win streak for that extended amount of time. And so I'm very curious to see whether Kimi will be able to do that or not. And I think that that is where George really has his opportunity to come back and fight the battle with Kimi, because I think that George, as a more experienced driver, has that ability and that stamina to push through for a whole season. That being said, the lead that Kimi has over George right now is quite a lot. I think there's like 40 odd points difference at the minute, and that is not a small margin. It's going to be difficult for George to close that gap. We are early in the season, it's definitely possible, but short of Kimi having the same kind of bad luck streak, it's going to take a lot of consistency from George to consistently be better than Kimi. And what I think is really interesting is that Canada is a racetrack that George really excels at. He's kind of gone on to say, yeah, like, this is my track, this is where I'm really good. And yes, he was, I think, the quicker car on the whole. I mean, he won the sprint, he was pole position after qualifying, but Kimi wasn't that far away from him. And in comparison, George kind of rode off Miami. He was like, oh yeah, like, Kimi is really strong here, but that's okay because I'm going to be really strong in Canada. But the difference between George and Kimi in Miami was quite a bigger gap compared to the gap between George and Kimi in Canada. So it's just something to keep in mind. Who do you think is going to come out on top? Do you think that Kimi is going to be able to keep up this win streak? Or do we think we're going to see somebody else on the top step of the podium in Monaco? So now that I feel like I've mostly exhausted the topic of the Mercedes drivers, although I feel like I could go on about this for so long because I have so many thoughts on the topic, there was a lot of other battles as well and excitement over the course of the weekend. In particular, one battle during the race that I really enjoyed was the one between Hamilton and Verstappen. Pretty close to the end of the race, Hamilton was just on a roll this weekend, which thank goodness, because I was getting a little bit worried about him. Going into the weekend, there were talks of, as per usual, of his retirement. He shut those down pretty much right away, saying he was feeling good. He had no reason to retire at the minute. He's got his head in the game. He is full throttle going forward, and I think that this weekend definitely helped to seal that deal. It was one of the few weekends when Lewis has actually been in front of Leclerc as well. It was a pretty tough weekend for Leclerc. Traditionally, though, this is a track that Leclerc hasn't been as good at, while Lewis has been very good at. He's won at this track 7 times, so I think that if Leclerc had been faster than him at this track, it really would not have been a very good sign for Lewis. Something he has actually been talking about is the fact that he isn't using the simulator anymore, which is very interesting. So the simulator will be used by both the driver and the team. It can be used by the team to kind of mock up the different setups that they want to do, and if you're interested in learning more about setup, I have done an episode on that previously. But yes, so he hasn't been working on the simulator. He also said that he wasn't working on the simulator before, I believe it was China, which was another weekend that he did very well at. Big strides for Hamilton and maybe pinpointing what the issue was as to why he couldn't quite feel like he was one with the car. He's obviously also settled in a lot more with the team. So all good signs coming from Ferrari, from the Hamilton side of the garage. Again, a little bit of a tougher weekend for Leclerc, but we do have Monaco next week, so I don't think we have to despair. I suspect he'll come back stronger, better than ever. Monaco is obviously a track that he is very, very strong at, so we'll see how it goes for him next week. But I do think that Monaco is really a chance for us to see a Ferrari on the podium. So fingers crossed for that. As I mentioned, it was a pretty exciting battle though between Hamilton and Verstappen. It felt like the good old days back like 21 time frame. Verstappen obviously has been struggling since the start of the season to get up there with the front runners, and this felt like a little bit of a turning point for them. Things have started to look up. He was putting up the fight. He was running P2 for quite a long time during the race. He was losing some tire temperatures at the end and lost the place to Hamilton because of that. And obviously he still sounded on the radio like he felt like there was a lot of improvements still to make. On the whole, it seemed like he was getting his mojo back, seemed like he was more engaged, more excited again. And I also think it's worth noting that Isack Hadjar actually was relatively close to Verstappen on the whole. It was his best result in the Red Bull, finishing in P5. So compared to a lot of Max's teammates in the past, that is pretty darn close. And I think it's an exciting development in the Red Bull garage to have them both up near the front and hopefully be able to work together. Did spend a decent amount of time in the pits actually. He did get a penalty. I don't think it was a super smooth weekend for him by any means, but the fact that he finished in P5, obviously taking into consideration the whole situation with the McLarens, which we will get into in just a moment. I think Hadjar has so far been a good teammate for Verstappen, and I hope that they continue to work on that and he gets more and more comfortable with the car and they're able to work together as teammates, which hasn't happened at Red Bull for quite some time. Moving on to talk about the McLarens. I have no idea what they were thinking. I am not saying that I am an expert, and obviously there was not just them who started on the intermediate tires, but they were the only ones of the front runners starting on the intermediate tires. And also, they started both of them on the intermediate tires, which just the whole combination of things wasn't adding up for me. And I cannot imagine Norris's frustration after he got out in first place on the opening lap and then had to immediately go to the pits because he was on intermediate tires and needed to put on slicks. And clearly, I mean, there must have been some indication, like I said, that there was some rain on the horizon. Other people did also start on the intermediate tires. I think the Audis did. I think Williams, at least one of them might have. So clearly there was something in the air, but it looked relatively dry after the first formation lap. And I just thought it was a weird decision. And then to make matters worse for both Norris and Piastri, Norris wound up having to retire due to a gearbox issue, and then Piastri started making his way back through the field, but then accidentally hit Alex Albon and took Albon out of the race, and he got a 10-second penalty, so he didn't even finish in the points. Despite looking pretty good in the sprint, like I said, Norris gave Russell a run for his money at one point, really took advantage of the skirmish between Russell and Antonelli. They just couldn't deliver in the race, which is really too bad. They still have a lot of things to work out there. They just seem to sometimes make the strangest strategy calls that team does. But hopefully they will continue to learn from the mistake and, you know, stay off of those intermediate tires unless it really looks like it's raining. As I mentioned, it was a tough weekend for Alex Albon. He was hit by Piastri and had to retire. Sainz, on the other hand, was looking pretty decent. He also started on the intermediate tires, but he was able to get back up and into the points, so decent weekend for him. Alpine, though, were looking extremely strong. Colapinto was the faster of the two this weekend, getting his best ever result in P6, which is really, really good. He beat his record of his previous best result, which was P7, which he got at the Miami Grand Prix. So overall, very good work on Colapinto's part, especially because he is next to the chopping block. He had to perform really well in the first few races of the season in order to ensure that he would be able to keep his seat, and I think that he has done an outstanding job with that. He has been able to ignore all of the pressure and just deliver the results. So very good weekend for Colapinto. He even damaged his front wing after hitting a wet patch and then still was able to finish in P6. Gasly also finished in the points in P8, so I think at Alpine they're feeling pretty happy. It was a little bit more of a mix for Racing Bulls. Lindblad wasn't able to start the race. He got stuck on the formation lap, but he had a really good showing in the sprint, managing to get points in P8. And Lawson was looking consistent. On the whole, though, I really just was so happy seeing the podium ceremony, like to see Verstappen along with Hamilton, along with Kimi, again, first to have his first 4 wins consecutively, accompanied by 2 multi-time world champions. That is a podium that I think is we're going to look at in several years' time and say, wow, these are some of the best drivers ever, all to compete together. And I think that that is really quite cool. Moving on to F1 Academy, there were actually 3 races taking place this weekend due to scheduling changes because they left out Jeddah. So we had the opening race, the reverse grid, and the feature race. It was a very big weekend for Alicia Palmowski. She was really just taking the weekend under her control. She was on pole, and then she won both the opening race and the feature race. And she won by 10 seconds in the opening race and then continued to win by even more in the feature race. So pretty iconic. Matilda Petz won the reverse grid race. Westcott and Bruce were P2 and P3 after qualifying, and Countryman started on pole for the reverse grid. In the feature race, Ella Lloyd had a very decent charge, going from P16 to P11 in the opening lap, and then eventually she wound up finishing in P6, so very impressive showing from her. During the reverse grid race, it looked like it was going to be Rafaela Ferreira for the win, but a 5-second penalty was handed to her on like the last lap of the race for a false start, demoted her down to P10. And there was a bunch of drama in the opening laps, which brought out the safety car on lap 2. Alicia Palmowski had a broken wing, so she wasn't able to make her way to the front on this race, but she definitely made up for it in her other 2 races. There was a little bit of contact between Megan Bruce and Nina Gademan, which brought out a second safety car. And then Albert Larson actually wound up finishing in 3rd place, but she was demoted due to a penalty for causing a collision with Emma Felbermeyer. There were several penalties handed out after the race, actually, to Ella Lloyd and Autumn Fisher. Autumn Fisher was our wildcard entry for the weekend. The last race was looking a little bit wet and cold, which kept things very interesting. Like I said, Palmowski, again, in a world of her own, running away with the lead. Emma Felbermeyer, Megan Bruce, and Peyton Westcott had a lot of excitement right at the end, with Felbermeyer able to take advantage of some mistakes of the previous 2 and make her way to P2. And then, despite reporting engine issues literally right at the end, Palmowski was still able to bring it home. Our next race is the Monaco Grand Prix. This is such an iconic track. If you haven't watched my episode that I did recently where I talk about the intersection of Formula One and luxury, I talk a lot about the history of the Monaco Grand Prix, so make sure to go check that out. The first Grand Prix was held here in 1929. It was organized for the Automobile Club de Monaco. It is such an integral part of Formula One history, having been included in the inaugural season of Formula One and then consistently in every every single season since 1955. It's a very narrow street circuit that's very difficult to overtake, and it is very much about where you qualify. The most chaotic Monaco Grand Prix actually took place here in 1996, where only 3 drivers actually managed to cross the finish line after a series of crashes and mechanical failures for the rest of the grid. You may also notice that the street circuit is very close to the water. Well, in 1955, Alberto Ascari accidentally took a little bit of a dip, diving right into the marina. Luckily, he was fine, rescued by spectators and sailors, but definitely not something we really want to repeat. So we're very grateful for all of the advances made in safety, so nobody has to go swimming when they don't want to. That is all for today's episode. I hope that you enjoyed. Again, make sure to follow us on Instagram at Grit Girls Formula and subscribe or follow the podcast for even more Formula One content. And I will see you next time. Bye.